My presentation is going, I even got page numbers on the presentation that will pertain to the sheets in here. So if you can't understand what I'm saying, it's written here as well. There's more information in the handout than there is
This is your headset.
in my PowerPoint. So I'll leave time for questions and answers. And I don't
Monty,
cover everything that's in
You can't reach Monty and
It's in
reach
the
out. You can reach
little
Monty through this. It's pretty straightforward. Talking to this old is,
We'll
speaking to
give
it, and
people
it's
a
like
few
this.
more minutes to come in. Yes.
Next one.
They compared me up against the women from the list. They did this to me in Chicago a few months ago, and we had very few people in our room. We had me and a couple other Muslim architect friends of mine had a panel discussion. Shall we wait a few minutes? Or more people coming? Keep going? All right. Anyway, so we had a small problem there. Well, I'm just going to start, since it's all in the book. If anybody comes in, if you don't mind, I point that towards the front and grab one of the booklets that's free to use. Now, you need to be behind the microphone. Right, brother? Assalamu alaikum. My name is Chris McCoy. I'm an architect from Lexington, Kentucky. The name of my company is McCoy Architects, so easy to remember. I'm Brother Chris. A little bit about me. I'll introduce myself. I am from Lexington, Kentucky. I went to the University of Kentucky College of Architecture, graduated in 1990. I actually became a Muslim and an architect in the same week, as luck would have it. I performed Shahada in 93. At the same time, earlier that year, I'd taken my boards and actually got my results the same week that I performed Shahada in our local masjid. I also, when I was a young architect, I designed a lot of churches. I worked for some architectural firms that did a lot of church work. So when I started my own practice in 1997, actually my first commercial project was a masjid. So right off the bat, I started designing masjids. Come on in, brothers. I have a handout here if you'd like to pick one up, and everything in my PowerPoint is going to be referencing that. I'm not much of a speaker, but I have spoken a couple of times. I spoke in Amsterdam at the Ramadan Festival in 2007. I came actually to DC in 2009 for a symposium or conference on the 21st century American mosque. And for the last 2 years, me and some other Muslim architect friends of mine have been giving a kind of panel discussion at the annual ISNA conference. Brother, there's a handout here if you want to pick it up that basically covers everything I'm talking about. Some of the masjids I've designed I think 7 masjids that have actually been built. Everybody asks me how many masjids have you designed, and that's actually kind of a complicated question because I don't always just design masjids. Sometimes there's development plans, sometimes it's a planning project, sometimes it's a renovation or an addition. A lot of times they don't get built, so I've designed many masjids. But, and again, I'm an architect, not a builder. As I've been corrected by many contractors, I design it, they build it. So I'm not going to stand up here and say that I built these masjids, but I did participate in design. Some of these first ones were small, modest structures. The Islamic Center of Eastern Kentucky on the top. A masjid in Somerset, Kentucky, and one in West Virginia. These are all relatively close to me. Assalamu alaikum. Brothers that are just coming in, I have a handout here. You're welcome to come grab one. You're not going to interrupt me. I'm going to have a question and answer session at the end, but if you have a question in the middle, just raise your hand. I'm not easily offended, and I'm used to critiques, so bring it on. Some other masjids, after I did those for the first few years, I did a larger masjid in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. That was a 400-person facility, and actually replaced the first purpose-built masjid in the state of Kentucky. That sounds so exciting. Also was doing a master plan for the Islamic School of Louisville, where they wanted to build a new masjid and community center, but it was a 4-phase development for a middle school, high school recreation facility. We did the master plan and zoning application for that. Some other masjids that I've gone south into Tennessee, where they just love Muslims down there. And I've gone north from Kentucky into Ohio, and I'm on my 9th year working for the Islamic Society of Greater Dayton, and alhamdulillah, we will do a punch list and occupy within a month or 2, inshallah. And there's a picture of the Islamic Center of Greater Dayton. Did about 3 designs for them. It's been value engineered twice. We've been constructing it for 4 years. So it is a labor of love. Probably the one masjid I've done that many people have heard about is the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro. It actually started with a different architect, and they did a zoning plan and got approved for their zoning plan, and the neighbors went ballistic after it was already approved. And there was a lot of uproar about it, made a lot of news for the people that were opposed to it. The masjid was not actually making news because the opposing neighbors didn't make it to the zoning hearing meeting. That's what they sued the government. So there was a lot of news about that. It was not actually directly about the masjid. They hired me to redesign their master plan and design the first phase, which was actually their multi-purpose facility, which is used as a masjid. A lot of people have heard of that one. Other masjids, as I get farther away from my home turf, I'm a consultant on masjids that are sort of far away. One of them is in Overland Park, Kansas, or Kansas City, where I was consultant. They actually have a local team there. I did both a master plan and a large masjid design for 900 people. And I'm currently working on masjids in Minneapolis, kind of a master plan, and a Bosnian masjid, my first Bosnian masjid, in Louisville, Kentucky. And I have some in Tennessee that I'm working on. I don't have pictures of everything I'm doing up here. I spend the whole time talking about myself. And working on a zoning application in Lexington for a Muslim community center, and recently did my first set design for a fictional masjid for a play, which is what you see on the top there, which was kind of fun. No client, no budget. It was awesome. What I'm going to tell you about today, again, if you haven't picked up one of the brochures, please come up and grab one. I'm going to hit some of the highlights of this. I wrote way too much. I apologize. Each slide's going to have a page number on it. That's referencing you to the page in the booklet, where you can find the pictures and diagrams there if you can't either see it on the screen. But some of the, can everybody hear me okay? You're welcome to come up. But I have to use the microphone or they can't catch my lovely face on video and my hoarse voice. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today are what we call scoping and organization. Scoping is when you're figuring out what to do when you're first starting, how big of a masjid, things like that. I'm first going to start right into the typical steps involved for the process, as if you just bought land and we're about to start the whole process. Because I'm an architect, I'm going to focus a lot on design issues. That's actually where most of the building committee's work will be, thinking about what you do. So I'm going to talk about the design process in general, all the governmental approvals, how to plan your site, how to flow in and out of the musalla, wudu areas, restrooms, shoes. I'm going to talk about some key features like domes and minarets, because everybody asks for them, and then some ideas on how to do some design synergies and think about future expansion. I am going to touch briefly on what goes on during construction, how to hire contractors, what kind of key roles are for everybody, and some typical contractor issues. And in concluding, I'm going to talk about some common mistakes to avoid that a lot of masjids make. I have some suggestions for you as well. And I'm going to give you some examples of other religious architecture to consider if we get that far. I need to get my phone out and watch my time. Okay, let's just get into the steps that are involved. I did a very complex and busy looking but not intimidating flowchart on page 2, where I take you from the very top of the page, where you have your mosque leaders and your experienced volunteers forming a building committee. So the first thing you need to do is get organized, form a building committee. Once you've done that, you're going to go into the kind of scoping out the project. What are you going to do? That usually happens simultaneously. Some key stakeholders, some big donors, some key people get together, and you start talking about what are we going to do? What do we need? So the first thing you do is figure out what you do. I highly recommend that before you either buy property or as you're buying property, you start thinking about hiring professionals or at least consulting with professionals to talk about land. Because you're probably going to need to develop either a master plan or a site plan and get that approved at the local zoning level. I'm going to go into this more later. There's a lot of complexity here to the flow chart in this part to see if there is a zoning permit required or not, where you buy land in that process, but that's to help keep you straight through there. You may have to then take that plan and take it to a public zoning hearing. If you have a property that is zoned appropriately for it, or you're doing an addition to your existing masjid, you can bypass this step and just get right down to the bottom half of the flow chart and get into designing the building. The bubble diagrams with lots of arrows wrapping around them are processes, basically big chunks of time when you're doing things. The building design is, several months of work of the building committee meeting with the designers. After the building is designed, two things happen. First and foremost, you bid that design out to contractors, or you negotiate a price with contractors to build it. At the same time, usually plan review is occurring for a building permit, which is separate from a zoning permit. Those happen generally simultaneously or in direct sequence of each other. And then, of course, alhamdulillah, if you get all the money together and you've got a good price, you start building. So now we're down to building. That could take a while. Hopefully, inshallah, it will not, but it can take a while. But at the end of that, you can finally move in and take occupancy. The goal line with any building project is occupancy. It's a legal term, and you are issued a certificate of occupancy for the project. Once you have that, then you can move in and start using the facility. Some key points along the way, and I've kind of alluded to them already. Brothers that are coming in, I have a handout up here you're welcome to grab. And the page numbers in the presentation reference you to pages in that handout. Don't worry about walking in here, just come on. Thank you, brothers. Some key points along the way are if you have to do a zoning or a site plan approval, you're going to get that approval. That's a very distinct moment in time. It's often announced as a milestone to the community. But most importantly is once your building is designed and your plan is reviewed, you can get a building permit. That's actually not for the masjid. It's for the contractor to set up the inspection process. But again, the final goal line is occupancy. And that is your moment when you can actually start using it. So I'm sorry, I use these terms a lot, and I forget that people in the construction industry don't use them, so I'm trying to define them off the bat. That little background hatch pattern you see, rising and then shrinking, is your money. You need to start raising money at the start of the process. You need to have figured out your money when you start construction. You need to have secured your money. If you want your construction project to go well, then you either need to have the money or have it in place, or since we can't take out loans, at least having the amount secured so that your contractors or builders can build the thing and be assured that they can work. You need to have that figured out at that point. That's why that line builds and then shrinks as you build. Let's talk a little bit about how you organize your building committee. It can be too big. An ideal size, in my opinion, is 5 to 7 people. You need to have, there are these categories that I list here. Some people may occupy 2 of those categories, but you need to have, obviously, mosque leaders need to be in this group. They don't have to be the imam. They're usually board members. You need to make sure that if your masjid is cosmopolitan, have different ethnic groups, that you have some representation, or at least be able to respond to the needs of the different varying ethnic communities. There needs to be some liaison between the building committee and the people that raise the money, the fundraisers. So usually it's a good idea to have someone who's on both of those committees. And I do recommend that the building committee be separate from the fundraising committee because the functions are drastically different. Please include women. This seminar is going on next door. I very, very rarely, if ever, have women on a building committee. And if they do, they don't stick around or are part of the process. And it is quite frustrating because for the one woman in the room, we talk about women's issues a lot in design, and there are very few women present. So please include them. A lot of times a masjid project is targeting the young adults, the young families growing up. How do we make a facility for future generations? But yet they're designed and built by older uncles, and not young adults. Now, young adults don't have a lot of time to give, that's understandable, but if you could have someone that was active in the masjid, that was on that committee, that can actually respond to what the target audience is, the young families, you might be surprised what they actually want out of their masjid. It might be different than what the first generation or second generation had. Yes, brother?
I just wanted to add something to that. If you don't do that in your masjids, the construction will probably stop because your community and members will object as you're building it.
Oh, they do.
Because once they realize they're not getting a women's lounge for women that can't pray that particular day, and the youth aren't getting anywhere for them, there's there's going to be issues that come up.
Yep.
And then it's going to cost a lot of money, because one thing that I didn't see raised in here, but you may go into, is change orders.
I will.
Change orders are much more expensive than the actual cost initially. So if something is gonna cost you $10 at the outset, it's gonna cost you $100 later on. So I didn't see that mentioned, so I just wanted-
Wait, I'll get there.
Okay, I'm sorry.
All right, scoping, nice word that we use as designers. We sometimes refer to it as the program. This is figuring out what you're going to do. Let me explain some things. New construction, which is a new masjid, is invaluable to a community. You know, a purpose-built masjid has great value. It costs twice as much to build than it does to buy. I wish it wasn't true, but it is. You can buy stuff for half the cost per square foot than you can build it from. So know that. Extensive renovation, though, renovation in general costs more per square foot than new construction. However, so, you know, if you do very minimal renovation, then obviously you've managed that well. But if you bought something that requires a dramatic renovation, then that may not have been the most cost-effective thing to do. So the least expensive thing to do, because a lot of us just ask me, brother, how cheap can we do this, is to buy an existing building and do minimal strategic renovation. Let's talk about budgeting. Everybody asks how much it costs to build a masjid, but that's actually not the question that completely, gets the best answer. There's a big difference between construction cost and project cost. There are other costs that are not in the cost of construction. By far, the cost of construction is the biggest item. It represents, on average, about 80% of the total building cost, or the total project cost. But another big one is the cost of land, and that can vary wildly. This is not a hard and fast percentage rule here that you're seeing there. I've just kind of averaged some projects to give you that. Land can be very expensive or very cheap. Architects and engineers generally work about like a realtor would, 6, 7, 8%, depending on the size of the project. Permits cost a little bit. And then there's some money on the back end as well for moving in equipment, audio, video stuff, furnishing, stuff that is typically outside that cost of construction. Construction costs themselves, anytime a contractor tells you something, you add time and you add money to that. And I recommend at least 15%. Nobody builds anything for what they cost when they first say what they're going to cost. So if somebody says it's going to cost this much, you add 15% to that, please. So thus the two values in yellow there represents about 80% of the project budget. But it's not the whole thing. So sometimes masjid groups focus entirely on construction costs and don't think about the rest. Property selection. Rarely am I consulted before a masjid actually goes out and buys property, so I'm going to explain it here. Urban sites, city sites are obviously the most expensive, but they're the most convenient. And that has value. However, they can be very expensive. So suburban sites are often still equally convenient, but still have site utilities and things like that to plug into. Rural sites can be very cheap, but can be very problematic. They're less convenient. Zoning can be more difficult. The further out you go from the city, the more difficult zoning generally gets. And site utilities can be astronomically expensive. To bring water to a rural site, the septic system for the Islamic Center in Murfreesboro cost $120,000 just for the pipes to flow out of the building. It was massive because you're building a convention center in farmland. That's why rural land costs so cheap, is because it costs so much to build out there. I'm going to get into occupancy. A lot of people ask me, how big of a masjid do I need for how many people? And there are a lot of different ways to compute it. Everybody kind of has their own feeling and their own opinion about it. But I'm going to tell you how the codes look at it, and I'm going to tell you that it's pretty good. The space that we need to pray is about 2 feet by 4 feet. Most people agree that a space in the musalla for each person is about 8 square feet. There's not a value in the International Building Code that most building codes are based off of for 8 square feet a person. There is one for 7, and it basically pertains to a setup a lot like we have right here, what they call loose chairs, unconcentrated load. And think about it, the amount of space you take out to pray is about like that without the aisles. So we have to use 7 square feet in calculating occupancy for the actual numbers. And I think it's a pretty good number, because sometimes for July we crowd in a little bit. Sometimes the rows get a little bit tight. For daily salah, we have about 8 to 10 square feet per person. So I think 7 is a good number, and it exists in the code. It's defined, so that's what I'm telling you to please use. A table and chair area, banquet setting, a hall, or something like that, is twice that, more than twice that, 15 square feet per person. So I did this nice little diagram of a stereotypical masjid, because this is by far the most common request. I want to build a masjid, and then I want to put the hall in the lower level or basement, preferably on a walkout. That is by far a common request. In order to accommodate everybody you put in the musalla, down below, that footprint's got to be twice as big as the space above it. And if you have a loft for women, you're more efficient in the musalla, but you're even worse downstairs. So those people that have come in for Ramadan can't even go down for iftar. Half of them have to leave if the building's only half the size. So think about that. The multi-purpose space takes up a lot more space. Not that you have to accommodate everybody for iftar, but it's an important point, because a lot of people, why does my multi-purpose hall only hold half of what I have in the musalla? It's because I'd have to build a huge basement. In fact, I just got asked that this week. Can you make the basement twice as big? It's like, well, what's going to be above it? So there's some good facts and figures in that guideline to help you calculate how big of a building you need to be, but consult a professional. Yes?
Can I ask you to comment on one item related to that? If you're putting the musalla on the first floor, the load for the floor and the cost related to having that basement space, how does it affect it? Because oftentimes people have this impression that basement space is just free.
It's not totally free. It is it's the least expensive space in any building construction project, because you have to put in a foundation anyway. Basically what a basement is a tall foundation system. Yes, it costs more to have a basement down there, and then when you add a kitchen and you add finishes, you pay for all those, but you don't have as much exterior wall. The most expensive part of any building construction project is the exterior walls and roof.
I guess what I was asking is, if you're going to put a multi-purpose space downstairs in the
Yes.
basement, like I said, there's this impression that it's free.
It's not.
It's not only is it not, but it seems to be that it's a very expensive proposition, because the floor system for the musalla upstairs now has to accommodate a much higher occupancy load, because you're not on a slab. And
True.
the bar joists.
Sure.
get to be
You have
very
structural
expensive.
systems that are going to span that space that cost more than it would be for a slab, absolutely.
So-
And you have to hold the floor above it. There's structural things, and yes, the floor typically needs to be bigger if you're trying to make the hall bigger. It's not always a good choice to put the multi-purpose hall below the musalla for these very reasons. In fact, I'm going to show you some examples of how to put it to the side, or make it phase 1 instead of phase 2. Or if you do consider that, recognize there's shortcomings to having a space underneath. Or it may be a reason why you don't want to consider a loft, because you want to spread all the Muslims out as far as you can, get the biggest hall possible. So there's some variables at play there. Design is much more of a process than people realize. People think that they just get the blueprints at the end of the job, and that's what the architect did, but it requires lots of meetings, lots of consultations, sketches, designs. It's a whole process. I'm not going to go into all the details of this. It's written there through pages 7 through 9. There are generally 5 phases of design. They go all the way from sketching, schematic design, all the way through design development and construction documents. That's when the architects and engineers are designing. Then there's a bidding phase, which is relatively short. And then there's construction. Designers are involved during construction. They come out to the job site, they observe things that are being constructed, they help manage the paperwork, pay requests, process change orders, things like that. I've given a list of what many consultants, there's usually a prime consultant, often the architect, at least in my experience, that then hires sub-consultants or sub-engineers underneath of them, like civil engineers, landscape architects, structural engineers, mechanical, electrical, those sort of things. Then there's sometimes some other consultants that the masjid will hire directly that usually go with the land, like topographic survey and geotechnical or subsurface investigation, borings into the ground. Those are all defined in the handout. I just strongly recommend that you seek professionals that have experience doing religious work. I'm totally biased. I do have a lot of experience doing this. I'm not here soliciting you. But get somebody that's done churches or something before, because the codes are unique. They're specific. A brother that drives a cab and did civil engineering back in Tunisia that has a degree here is not necessarily a qualified design professional for your masjid. He's maybe never done it before. He may have the best of intentions. He may be a great guy, maybe a good designer, but he may not understand the codes. I have family members that were trained as architects that still don't understand the code because they don't do it for a living. So get people who do this for a living, please, that are giving you real advice. Don't get someone who built something 20 years ago. Things change. I'm going to keep moving. Government approvals and permissions. There are generally two major types of government approvals that you need to get. First goes with the land. I've talked about this a little bit. Land use, zoning, land use approvals. If you buy a new property or you're expanding your existing property, you have to first identify how you're going to use that land and get an approval from a local authority, usually a local zoning board or planning commission, to accommodate that. This is the only time the public can typically comment on a project, and it's one you hear the most news about. But it's usually easy if you have a good site and you have a good design that doesn't ask for a lot of variances or special requests. The hardest part is buying property big enough to hold a masjid. But all of this precedes a building permit. If you go through it and you get zoning approval, you are not done with the approval process. You have gotten land use approval. It's often, I hear it announced in the masjid at Jummah, we have permission to build. It's like, no, you have permission to use the land that way. And there's often a time limit that's only good for. So you need to get on with the building design and building construction, or else it's going to run out. So sometimes they're more proceeding, and sometimes there are some jurisdictions that once you get it, then it sticks with the land and it's zoned that way. So get a professional that's used to doing this. Building permit is actually not issued to the masjid, or to you. It's issued to the contractor, and it sets off a series of inspections by various inspectors to come and see things. It is not typically a public process. It may be part of the public record. But obtaining a building permit is not nearly what you hear in the news. Those are usually zoning or land use approvals. Building permit, again, is for the contractor. And again, at the very end, you get your certificate of occupancy. Then you can move in and use the facility. Don't hold the fundraising in a construction site. It's still a job site. Many masjids do this. They get up to about 75%. They've got plywood on the floors. And they're like, bring the whole community in. You got to get a hard hat for everybody. They've got to be supervised. You got OSHA regulations. Oh, I can't. I've been invited to come to those, and I'm like, I can't let everybody into a job site. It's still a job site, unfortunately. Even though the community wants to see it, it is a job site. Don't forget about that. So you can't legally move in until you get a certificate of occupancy, which we call a CO. Site planning. This is the site plan for the Islamic Center in Murfreesboro. And it's a pretty good example of what I want to point out, that a lot of times masjids need to move into their property gradually, build phase 1, phase 2, things like that. And I highly recommend that because it helps manage your cost, and it allows you to grow into the property over time, particularly if you've bought a large piece of property and you have a grand vision. Break it into phases. You don't need to design all these buildings in great detail. It's much more about preserving space and thinking about the order in which things come in. Because the reality is, once you survive a building project, it's going to be new players the next time, or at least evolved players. Usually I wear out the chairperson of any building committee, and they don't want to come back for the second project, so things change. But if you've at least strategically located things on the site where that next phase can occur, you haven't blocked progress, so to speak. So planning is important, and get a professional to do it. But if it's done right, you can grow in a way that makes a lot of sense. I wanted that project in Murfreesboro that was actually started with a different designer, and then I came in and redid the master plan. We put their wish list into 4 phases, and they're not uncommon. Big masjid, multi-purpose hall or banquet hall, an Islamic school, and a recreation facility. That, of course, was phase 4, with an indoor pool for sisters that can swim in privacy and those sort of things. So that was all on the wish list. They didn't have money to build all that, obviously. They did not actually build the masjid first. The first building was the multi-purpose facility. But they wanted to think about how all those came together. So this is that plan that I just showed you in black and white. And the large masjid is designed in the northeast corner towards the Qibla. And the masjid holds 1,000 people. It can fill up with men and women. and hold 1,000 people in that arrangement, you actually come in through a courtyard. But the other spaces, the multipurpose hall and the gym, were both strategically located so that for Eid, whenever they have a huge community, everybody can come in. The men can, after the musalla has filled up, the men can flow into the gym, and the ladies can backflow into the multipurpose hall. And so they, within the facilities, they have on site, they can have 2,600 people all facing the Qibla behind the Imam. Now, 2 of those rooms are outside. People that arrive late, I'm sorry, I'm an equal opportunity discriminator. If you come late, you're in the other building, but nonetheless you're on property. You don't have to rent a convention center, things like that. So if you strategically place your key spaces, and you can use them together to accommodate more people on site instead of having to rent off-site facilities, if your community will go for that. So just leave that where that is. I want to get into the building a little bit. How am I doing on time? There are many masjids that have separate entries for men and women. That's understandable. I'm not here to argue against it. The women-friendly masjid is next door. But if you have separate entries, make sure that they're both welcoming. There's still Muslims coming, whether they're men or women, to each of these doors. So make sure they're open, make sure they can get in. If there's a keypad on the men's door and not on the women's, women don't feel welcome to come at odd times, at other prayers. Usually separate doors implies that the masjid is going to be segregated within, so they need to be strategically located. This is an interesting fact, and it's relatively new in the building code. The fire exits that are required in any building usually assume that half the people are going to go out the front door. And a lot of masjids design themselves to have 2 doors. So if one is considered the main door, that one's got to hold the load of half the people getting out in case of fire. And think about it. Most people, if the fire alarm went off in here, we'd go out that door. We would. Where's the other door, by the way? Actually, this room doesn't have a second exit, but that is a problem. That's an important fact that a lot of people overlook. Each prayer space has to have 2 exits. If you've got more than 50 people in one area, you have to have 2 ways out, and they have to be fairly far apart from each other. So when you have a separate sisters area from a separate men's area, you have to have 4 ways out. It gets complicated very quick. Sometimes a women's entry is marginalized, and I'll just stop right there. Some more successful designs, in my opinion, actually have 3 doors, have a common, shared, main, obvious front door for anybody, for visitors, for people of other faiths, for families that come in, and then there's a door towards the men's side and a door towards the sister's side. Then if sisters want privacy or men don't want to see them, they can accommodate that. It also spreads people out. So I found that to be a good design, 3 doors. More is always better. And then, of course, consider a separate entry for kitchen and things like that. The flow diagram. This is easy to draw, really hard to implement. But we all know that we come in, take our shoes off before we go into the salah. We all know that. But going to the restroom and or having to make wudu within that process gets complicated pretty quick. And it's not as clean as people think, and we all have different opinions on exactly how that should be. So when you're designing a masjid and you're working with your designer needs to fully understand this point and be able to talk intelligently with you about it, about how people are going to flow through the masjid. We use the term transition area, which is usually the shoe area, but it also incorporates the wudu area because that's where you're transitioning from shoes off to shoes on. That's what transition area means. Some people will come in the lobby, need to go to the restroom, and then go back out and keep their shoes on. The only mitigating factor to this and complexity to it is that a lot of Muslims in America make wudu in the restroom. So if the restrooms, which most people agree need to be far away from the musalla, they don't need to be far away from the wudu area. So it's very tricky to get all of these things